3. 1001 Small Things. The Washington Shell House would eventually become a kind of home to Joe Rance, but on the first day of practice, he and the other freshmen did not even row. The afternoon was largely consumed by the collection of facts and figures. Joe and Roger and all the other hopefuls were told to step onto scales, to stand next to measuring sticks, to fill out forms detailing their medical backgrounds. Assistant coaches and older students carrying clipboards stood by, eyeing them and recording the information. Few of the young men assembled outside the Shell House that afternoon had ever rowed a stroke in their lives. Most of the freshmen were city boys, but a few, like Joe, were farm boys or lumberjacks or fishermen. They came from foggy coastal villages, damp dairy farms, and smoky lumber towns all over Washington state. Growing up, they had wielded axes and fishing gaffs and pitchforks, building up powerful arms and broad shoulders. They were strong, and the coaches knew their strength would help those boys, but they also knew rowing was at least as much art as brawn. There were 1001 small things that had to be learned and performed in precisely the right way to propel one of those narrow shells through the water with speed and grace. Over the next few months, the few boys who made the team would need to master every last one of those 1001 small things. And in those few months, some essential questions would be answered. Would the farm boys be able to keep up with the intellectual side of the sport? Would the city boys have the toughness to survive? Tom Bowles. Al Ulbrichtson. The freshman coach, Tom Bowles, was in charge that day. He would be the one to decide which 9 boys would make the first freshman boat. But another man stood quietly in the broad doorway of the Shell House. He was tall, with cold slate-gray eyes, and he was dressed impeccably in a dark 3-piece business suit, a crisp white shirt, and a tie. His name was Al Ulbrichtson, and he was the head coach of the rowing program. Ulbrichtson was known as the least talkative man on campus. Some of the local sports reporters called him the man with the stone face. He did not like to show his emotions, but he knew the sport of rowing well. He had been the lead rower or stroke or of a Washington crew that had won national championships in 1924 and 1926. The college had quickly hired him as a coach after graduation. Now rowing was the center of his life and almost a religion to him. The new boys sauntered along the dock, getting a feel for the long, yellow spruce oars. Many of the freshmen, Ulbrichtson noted, looked fit. As a group, they were tall and moved gracefully. Ulbrichtson was pleased by what he saw. When Bowles and his assistant coaches released the boys for the day, Joe Rance and all the rest straggled up the hill toward the campus. They moved in small groups, shaking their heads, talking softly among themselves about their chances of making the team. Ulbrichtson stood on the floating dock, listening to the lake water lap at the shore, watching the boys leave. He was studying them closely because he was thinking well beyond the upcoming season. The previous year had been a strong one for the Washington team. They defeated their arch rivals from the University of California, then beat out the best crews the East had to offer, including Yale, Cornell, and Harvard. But Ulbrichtson was not satisfied. In 1932, a crew from California had won Olympic gold. No Washington coach had ever even come close to taking a team to the Olympics. The next games were set to take place in Berlin, Germany, in 1936, and Al Ulbrichtson didn't just want to get a crew there. He wanted to bring gold home to Seattle. To pull it off, the coach knew he was going to have to clear a series of imposing hurdles. He'd have to outsmart Cal coach Kite Ebright, who was widely regarded as the intellectual master of the sport. Ebright had an uncanny knack for winning the big races, the ones that really counted. Ulbrichtson needed to find a crew that could beat Ebright's best when it mattered most. Then that crew would have to outrace the top boats from the East at the Olympic trials. Finally, if they did earn the right to represent the United States, they'd face the best oarsmen in the world. They would have to beat the British, who had practically invented the sport, the Italians, who had nearly won in 1932, and the Germans who, under the new Nazi system, were said to be building extraordinarily powerful and disciplined crews. Before he could get to Germany, though, Ulbrichtson had to find the 9 young men who would make up his crew. He wondered if any of those green and untested boys he had just watched on the dock might meet his strict qualifications. They'd need raw power, superhuman stamina, and solid intelligence to master the details of rowing technique. But they would need something else as well. Something even more important. To be part of that kind of crew, a gold medal crew, each young man would also have to be able to put aside his own personal ambitions. He'd have to throw his ego over the side of the boat to leave it swirling in the wake of his shell. He'd need to pull, not just for himself, not just for glory, but for the other boys in the boat. 4. Life in exile. Joe Rance was no stranger to pulling for himself. He'd been forced to do so at an early age. After the fire burned down their home, 9-year-old Joe and his family moved to the camp near the Idaho mine, the Gold and Ruby, where Joe's father worked. Harry Rance no longer had to make the long drive back and forth, but their new home was a stark change from Spokane. The Boulder City camp consisted of 35 small cabins and a few other ramshackle buildings clinging to the side of a mountain. Wooden sidewalks stretched from one building to the next. A one-room schoolhouse stood on a flat spot among the pines, but there were few children and attendance was low. A rutted dirt wagon road plunged from the schoolhouse down the mountainside, cutting back and forth to the base before spilling onto a bridge across the Kootenai River. To Thula, it was a dismal place, but to young Joe, Boulder City was a wonderland. When his father operated the mine's huge steam shovel, Joe could perch happily on the rear end of the machine and ride it as it swung around in circles, almost like the carousel back in Spokane. His father built him a go-kart, and Joe dragged it up the steep roads to the top of the mountain. He pointed the cart downhill, climbed in, and released the brake. He raced down the road at breakneck speed, careening around the hairpin turns, whooping at the top of his lungs all the way to the river and across the bridge. Then he climbed out and began the long trek back to the top of the mountain and did it again and again. He didn't stop until it was too dark to see the road. When he was in motion, outdoors, the wind in his face brushed away all the anxiety that had been eating at him since his mother's death. He felt alive. Joe, right, with Thula, carrying Mike and Harry, carrying Harry Jr. at the Gold and Ruby mine. When winter closed in and the mountainside was deep in powdery snow, his father got out the welding equipment and built Joe a sled. With it, he could rocket down the wagon road at even more terrifying speeds. Sometimes, when the adults weren't watching, he'd take Harry Jr. up the mountain. Joe would find one of the railroad carts used to carry or down the mountain, give it a shove, and then jump in with his little brother. The two boys would rattle down the tracks at terrifying speeds with Harry Jr. in front, shrieking in delight. When he wasn't hurtling down the mountain, Joe helped out at the mill, attended the one-room school above the camp, explored the woods, and climbed among the 6,400-foot-tall mountains in the national park nearby. He swam in the river and hunted for deer antlers and other treasures in the woods. At home, on a small plot of ground inside the picket fence surrounding his family's cabin, he tended his very own vegetable garden. But that little garden didn't produce nearly enough to satisfy Joe's hunger. He was growing fast, and he inhaled food as quickly as his stepmother made it. Thula worried constantly that her own boys, Harry Jr. and Mike, wouldn't get enough to eat. And the household wasn't getting any smaller. Thula was pregnant again, with her third child, and she was miserable living in that tiny cabin on the mountainside. She was beautiful, educated, and artistic. When she was young, growing up on a farm, she had been determined to seek a finer life when she left home. Now she was stuck in Boulder City. It was unbearably hot and dusty in the summer, wet and muddy in the spring and fall. Winter brought the worst of it. Come December, bitterly cold air from Canada made its way through every crack and crevice in the walls of her flimsy cabin. It sliced through whatever layers of clothing she put on. She had hoped to become a concert violinist, but her beloved violin mostly sat on a shelf these days. Her hands were so cracked and sore from the cold, dry Idaho air that she could hardly hold the bow. She was still saddled with a screaming infant, a bored and complaining toddler, and a stepson who seemed to think of nothing but eating. It did not help that to pass the time Joe sat in the cabin and plucked incessantly at a ukulele, singing and whistling the corny songs that he and his father seemed to enjoy. One warm summer afternoon, her tension and frustration finally boiled over. She was in the kitchen, shoving pans around the stovetop angrily, while Joe was outside, down on his hands and knees, working in his vegetable garden. That little garden plot was a sanctuary for him. He was in charge of it, not Thula, and it was a source of enormous pride. When he could bring a fresh basket of tomatoes or an armful of sweet corn into the cabin and then see them on the dinner table that night, he felt that he was contributing. He felt he was helping Thula, maybe making up for whatever he might have done lately to annoy her. That afternoon, as Joe was working his way down row after row, pulling weeds, he turned around to find his 18-month-old brother following him. Mike was imitating Joe, only he wasn't pulling weeds. He was plucking half-grown carrots out of the ground. Joe turned and bellowed at him in rage. Mike unleashed a long, wailing scream. A moment later, Thula ran down the steps, red-faced and seething. She snatched Mike up from the ground, whisked him into the cabin, and slammed the door behind her. When Joe's father came home from work later that evening, Thula was waiting for him in the doorway. She demanded that he take Joe out back and whip him with a belt, but Harry merely took him upstairs and gave him a good talking to instead. Thula exploded. She declared that she would not live under the same roof as Joe, that Harry must choose between him and her. She said Joe would have to move out if she were to stay in such a godforsaken place. Joe was only 10 years old. Early the next morning, Joe's father led him up the wagon road to the schoolhouse at the top of the hill. He left Joe sitting outside on the steps and went in to talk to the male schoolteacher. Joe sat and waited in the morning sunlight. He drew circles in the dust with a stick and stared sadly at a Steller's jay. The bird had perched on a nearby branch and begun screeching at him. It seemed to Joe that even the bird was scolding him. After a long while, his father and the teacher emerged from the schoolhouse and shook hands. They had struck a deal. Joe was to chop enough kindling and split enough wood to keep the school's huge stone fireplace stoked day and night. In return, he would have a place to stay. From now on, he was going to sleep at the school. So began Joe's life in exile. His stepmother would no longer feed him, so every day he trudged down the wagon road to the miners' cookhouse for breakfast and dinner. The meals weren't free. Joe worked for the company cook, Mother Cleveland. He carried heavy trays of steaming food from the cookhouse to the dining hall next door, where workers in dirty coveralls sat at long tables covered with white butcher paper. The plates were heaped high with hotcakes and bacon in the mornings and with slabs of meat and potatoes in the evenings. The men talked loudly and ate ravenously. As they finished their meals, Joe hauled their dirty dishes back to the cookhouse. In exchange for his efforts, Joe could eat all the bacon and hotcakes and meat and potatoes he wanted. In the evenings after dinner, he trudged back up the mountain to the schoolhouse to chop more wood, do his homework, and sleep. The gold and ruby mine cabins. The work and the food proved good for Joe in one way. He continued to grow rapidly in size and strength. The long treks up and down the mountain built up his legs. Swinging the axe at the schoolhouse sculpted his arms and shoulders. He ate all he could at the cookhouse, yet he still always seemed to be hungry for more. Food was never far from his thoughts. When the schoolteacher taught him how to find edible mushrooms out in the woods, Joe was thrilled at the notion that he could find food that others might walk by without even noticing. Still, his world had again grown dark, narrow, and lonely. There were no boys his age in the camp. His best friends had been his father and Harry Jr. Now, living alone, he pined for the times when the three of them sneaked out behind the cabin to toss a ball around among the pine trees or to roughhouse in the dust. He missed how they used to pound out their favorite songs on the piano when his stepmother wasn't around. He missed the times he'd spent alone with his father, playing cards or tinkering with their big Franklin touring car. Most of all, he missed the times he and his father would sit out at night on the cabin's porch and stare up into the astonishing swirls of stars shimmering in the black Idaho sky. They'd sit there, together, saying little, mostly just being together, breathing in the cold air, waiting for a falling star to wish upon. Sometimes his father would whisper, "Keep your eyes peeled. The only time you can't see one is when you stop watching." Sitting on the schoolhouse steps alone at night and watching the sky just didn't seem the same.